All right, everybody, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and we're going to get to the last part of this lecture. We're going to talk about sexuality and disability. So again, most of our conversations that surround sexuality and disability are shredded with ableism, or the idea, again, that an able-bodied person is structurally more sound. And the sexual ableism is this idea that within sexuality has to look a specific way, which requires you to have a able-bodied people. Disability is a wide range of physical and psychological impairments that impose limits on a person in one or more activities of their life. Sexual agency is the idea that someone can create consent to sexual activities. And so when it comes to a wide range of neurodivergencies, there and or specific medical ailments that leave someone incapable of having sexual agency in ways that we have created as a normalcy, we tend to, as a society, pretend or assert that they are sexually inactive and or want to be sexually inactive or incapable of consenting, which is not always the case. Sexual citizenship is this idea that everyone has a right and a legality to be able to engage in sexual activity. And so, however, that is severely limited for those who are disabled, and it's severely limited in ways that are in some ways inaccurate and discriminatory. So it talks about erratic segregation or an invisibility of disabled individuals when it comes to conversations about sexuality, or specifically conversations about imagery maintaining sexuality. So things like porn, and there are social taboos to engaging in sexual interactions with somebody who is physically or psychologically disabled. And there's also social control mechanisms to ensure that there are social consequences specifically to those who engage, who are able-bodied, that might engage with those who are disabled. The disability rights movement really has been lacking in having these conversations, and these conversations are relatively new within the movement because there was more of a push for other rights and other accessibility issues. And so really being able to have conversations surrounding disability and sex, there's been really a really big lapse in understandings of this. However, if you really want to dive into disabilities pedagogy on the topic, or just on multiple topics in general, there's a book called Feminist Queer Crip, and it's written by one of my favorite feminists, and I can link you guys to the library version of that if you want to. So just give me a shout if that's something that you're interested in. There is, again, the medical model of disability, which is talking specifically about anatomical issues or psychological issues that really bring disability to a very medical textbook type thing, and really section out those who have disabilities as being labeled as their disability, as opposed to a person with a disability. And then there's the social model of disability, which again has which discusses the social consequences and understandings of disability. So sexuality and physical disability, there's mismessaging in the research on in a lot of the research on the amount that and or how sexuality is an issue and or a point of concern for those who are physically disabled. And again, part of that is going to be because physical disability comes in a really wide range of understandings. You have long-term illnesses, you have chronic illnesses, you have cancers, you have physical limitations from birth, you have amputees, you have those with any kind of other medical ailments, you have hearing impaired, you have visually impaired, you have I don't know. there's so many. That's kind of the point I'm getting at. And so for each one of these, sexuality could look very different, and or could be something that, like, so for those who are deaf, like, that isn't really a conversation that needs to be had, because a deaf person isn't necessarily labeled physically disabled at the gate, because it requires an interaction to understand that. And if they read lips well enough or can speak well enough, in that conversation, there's going to be little really difference for that individual when it comes to sexuality. And so again, that's going to be very different than somebody who maybe is paralyzed from the neck down, right? That's a very different conversation. And so again, there's going to be mixed messaging in the research, because homogenizing disability, especially physical disability, gets really problematic. There's a role of a caregiver that interferes with a sexual relationship. And so there's times where those who live with a physical ailment do better when they live in separate locations but are sexually active together, because the distinction between caregiver and sexual relationship becomes like purposeful. But it can also just cause desexualization of the partner. And anytime a caregiver is part of that, it can also be a different kinds of intimacy, and that you can know somebody on all aspects of life, and can be looked at in multiple ways. Humans have the ability to essentially divert attention to what needs to be done in the moment when it comes to physical ailments, and then still look at a person as if they are someone who is sexually attractive. And we are capable of having both in relationships. It's just a matter of all parties being willing of that. There are stereotypes of those who are physical disabled as dependent or asexual or burdening. And those things can have a real impact on the ability to have social interactions that are for the purpose of sex within the grander social world. There's also a conversation about what real sex is. Generally, when someone describes what actual sex is, it's penetrative male and female sex. However, when it comes to physical disabilities, limitations can arise to where sex can look and can be maintained using very different aspects, including say using sex toys and or having non-penetrative sex in order to create a sexuality or a pleasurable experience for those who are engaging in that activity. Sexual scripts also denote that within sexuality, there's a lot of specific positions or specific types of sexual encounters that are supposed to happen, or a specific pattern of sexual encounters that are supposed to happen. However, within the realm of physical disability, those may not be options, and or the options may have to look different. And so that just switches up how someone would want to or engage in these activities. And again, just there's a wide array of physical disabilities, and some are more taboo than others, right? So an amputee might not have as much, like a deaf person's not going to have as much as an amputee, is not going to have as much as someone who's in a wheelchair, is not going to have as much as someone who say has a lot of care needs, right? So there's a wider range and a hierarchical structure even within disability that determines someone's access to their own sexuality and to others who might want to be sexually active to them. So there's a lot of cultural misunderstandings or assumptions that are made that are surrounding sexuality and those who are have an intellectual disability, or the more appropriate term is neurodivergent. And there's a cultural assumption that they have no sexuality, or the assumption over that they have an over sexualization, depending on what those disabilities are, and what kind of neurodivergency there is. And thus it is risky and inappropriate to have sex with them. That there's an inability to consent, which again is not always the case. All of those with intellectual disability are the same, which again, there's a wide range of neurodivergencies that can lead to varying different understandings of sexuality. There is a wrong assumption that they are incapable of being sexually active, and there's a history of forced sterilization and legal sterilization that is specifically geared towards these individuals that to an extent is still going on. And again, that's also talked about in the book that I was referring to earlier. So disability and sex work. So there's a commodification of disabled bodies, which in and of itself can create power differentials that can be viewed as not benefiting those who with disabilities. And there are also things that individuals with disabilities can do. Now, none of this is legal in the United States, but in other countries, there are sex assistants, which is a trained person who sexually assists a person with physical and sometimes mental disabilities in engaging in self-pleasuring and or partnered pleasuring activities. It's illegal again in the US. Access is limited. There's still the ability to find that in the US, but again, access is limited and depends on economic means. There's a social norms and boundaries to sexual relationships. There's assumptions of relationships, intimacy, and sexual desire that's all built into these sexual assistants, and really having realistic conversations about that, because we have this assumption that any disabled person would really want a relationship, not just want a sexual encounter, and that is not always the case. Sexual surrogates are hired to help to assist someone who experiences sexual dysfunction and to empower clients to be able to engage in meaningful and satisfying relationships. So often this person is they have something called surrogate partner therapy. It's really controversial, but most of the work is done in non-sexual interactions, and the therapist is there to really work through the couple's ability to make sexuality more of a forefront of the relationship. And there's disability porn, which is invisible. There's a lot of invisibility in this media, but what is there's a lot of fetishization or exploitation and power differentials within the displays of disability. There's not a whole lot of really good feminist or disability focused porn that would make something feel very empowering. However, this is a celebration of the sexual potential, and the fact that it does exist to an extent is something that is considered a positive for some individuals with disabilities. There is a double invisibility of LGBTQ plus disabled persons, and that's because their understanding of sexuality can be very limited depending on their caregivers or controlled by their caregivers. And so there's going to be the assumption of heteronormativity if there's any assumption of sexuality at all. The access to sex education for those with disability is very, very limited. And the women with intellectual disabilities tend to have less exposure and cling to gendered heteronormative understandings due to the caregivers who work with them. There's a lack of options depending on the caregivers again. The diversity framework really is a more mindful understanding of how disability tends to be bubbled in a way where not everyone who is disabled gets to have the same interactions with the world and is controlled in a very different way than your average individual person that could go out and have a more visual representation of diversity. And then again, last but not least, disability is not homogenous. And so anytime this kind of conversation comes up, it is very mindful to make sure you understand that for every disabled person, their limitations are different, their interactions are different, and their understandings of themselves are different. And so first and foremost, listen and believe those with disabilities and what they can and cannot accomplish. So again, this is the last lecture for this particular series of this particular module. If you have any questions or concerns, please don't hesitate to ask. Thanks so much.